I'd like to thank all of you for coming on this rainy day to talk about Tajikistan. The timing, I think, of the panel, as Marlene has already suggested, is good, although not always for good reasons. Now, at least my perception here as a scholar in Washington, it's a time that's similar to the days immediately following 9/11, so over a decade ago. And what I mean here is the perceptions of fear, of concern, of worry about Islam and its role have taken on, I think, a new heightened level that we haven't seen for quite some time. And there's reason for this. The atrocities that ISIS is committing are scary. The Paris bombing demonstrated that these things are not distant events, but can happen, quote unquote, in Western capitals at home, right? So it's hitting a nerve which we here in the United States haven't perceived for quite some time. And my concern, and this is a concern based on an observation when I first came to the area, Northern Virginia, in 2006, is that with heightened worries about Islam come new lenses, sometimes narrow lenses, with which we view Islam. There's sometimes a rush to attribute to Islam some kind of causality, some kind of perception of militancy, which maybe in some cases is justified, but the central idea that I would like to leave you with today is that in many cases it isn't justified. And what I'd like to do is use a wide lens to look at Islam in Tajikistan over the past 25 years. And using this wide lens suggests to you that fears about radicalization and militancy in Tajikistan with regards to Islam are likely overblown. One note about Kuvatov, Marlene already brought this up. The 24 movement was labeled an extremist movement by the Tajik government. This is just the most recent example of how we see this rhetoric applied, I think sometimes inaccurately, maybe even for instrumental reasons, against what is not an Islamist opposition, but rather a political opposition. The parliamentary elections that you mentioned, I know we're going to talk about this I think in the first panel there'll be a discussion of this, but these were elections that yielded only pro-presidential parties. The only Islamic party in Central Asia, indeed for the former Soviet Union, the IRPT, didn't cross the 5% threshold. So the space for discussing Islam or Islam as an organizing principle in Tajikistan is shrinking. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind here, and I think we have to be very careful with how we view Islam in Tajikistan and not jump into some of the rhetoric that is coming not only from the Tajik government, but as I'll illustrate in a second, also other governments, including my own. What I'd like to do is first address this fear of radical Islam and give you an example of where some of this discourse is emerging. The second thing I'd like to do is provide this broader view of Islam in Tajikistan by looking at three events, three phenomena that are typically portrayed as potentially militant, right? And this is the Tajik Civil War, the Rasht Valley events of 2010, and Harod 2012. These are all events that have had elements of militant Islam, radical Islam, foisted upon them in interpretations, particularly interpretations by the Tajik government. And lastly, I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts about U.S. engagement of Tajik state and society in light of this lens that I'm providing, this lens that suggests perhaps we're not looking at radical Islam or even a threat of radical Islam, but rather a government that is instrumentally leveling the charge of radical Islam for instrumental reasons. Okay. congratulations on International Women's Day. This is not a gratuitous Women's Day picture. There's a reason why I have this here. President Rahmon gave an interesting speech a couple days ago. It was actually 2 days before International Women's Day. I guess it's Mother's Day in Tajikistan. And I'll just read a couple outtakes from that speech because I think it's instructive of the broader phenomena that I'm discussing here. He said, quote, "Do the mothers of those misled persons or they themselves not know that the place of such young people is hell? Do they not know that Syria and Iraq are Muslim countries and the greater proportion of the people who are dying every day are Muslims? I reiterate that indifference of families in society to such a plague of the century will have dire consequences. We must strictly control our children. If we don't, we'll have dire consequences. We can't allow them to be misled by propaganda and extremist groups or join extremist and terrorist groups and betray their homeland and become killers." An interesting speech to give on Mother's Day. Of course, he's referring to the idea that young Tajik men are traveling to Syria to fight for ISIS. The Tajik government has said between 200 and 300 Tajiks are fighting in Syria, that 50 Tajiks have already been killed in this fight. It's already brought at least 25 charges against Tajiks for participating or trying to participate in the Syrian conflict, and has detained at least another 150 people. So this is very much on the radar of the Tajik government. And to a certain extent, it's also on the radar of the US government. And here I just reference a quote from Ambassador Blake, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia, Central Asia, and South Asia. He begins, this is a quote from 2013, he says, "The limited threat currently posed by Islamic militancy in Central Asia and the failure of radical ideology to take root are no reason for complacency." So it might be limited now, but be careful. Central Asian states face real security challenges, not only from violent extremists, but also from cross-border threats such as drug trafficking and organized crime. So Blake is saying that the threat isn't pronounced now, but there's potential. And I would disagree both with Blake and with the Tajik president and say that the threats are a bit overblown. And let me just run you through 3 events that will help you understand, or you probably actually most of you probably understand far better than I do. I'll be perfectly blunt. I don't claim any unique knowledge. My only unique knowledge is as a scholar who interacts frequently with the DC policy community. But 3 events that would suggest that really this is overblown. This is really overblown. First, again, is the Tajik Civil War. Then I'll talk about Rosh Valley 2010 and Harog 2012. So the Tajik Civil War. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, that there were Islamists who were engaged in the Tajik Civil War. The only challenge is they were Uzbek. So Tahir Yaldash, Juma Namangani, these are militant Islamists. They got chased out of Uzbekistan in March 1992. They found refuge in Tajikistan. They joined the UTO. They fought alongside a wide group of oppositionists who were challenging the Tajik government. After the Civil War, they remained in Tajikistan. They used Tajikistan as a base for staging incursions into Uzbekistan. And they were evacuated in 2000 with the help of the Tajik government, with the Minister of Emergencies in 2000, evacuated to Afghanistan. So I don't deny that there are some militants who have been in Tajikistan. There's other militants who I'm not talking about, but yeah, there are a handful of people. What I think is interesting, though, is if you look at the primary protagonist of one of the primary protagonists of the Civil War. If you look at the Islamic Renaissance Party, at the very time Namangani and Yaldash were becoming more extremist, that is these Uzbek militants who are based in Tajikistan were becoming more extremist, the IRPT was becoming secular, right? So if you look at the charter of the Islamic Renaissance Party, the 1999 charter, it stipulated that should it win elections, which of course it never would, right? But were it to win elections, it would not seek to replace the secular government with an Islamist government. And if you look at the statements made by the IRP consistently over the past 16 years, that message is clear, that there's no effort here to establish some kind of Islamist government. Rather, this is a party that operates within the bounds of secularism. So, yes, there were people during the Civil War who were united by this party, the IRPT. They engaged in militancy, but there was a lot of people. There were Democrats, right, quote unquote Democrats, who fought the government as well. So I think it would be a mistake to look at the Tajik Civil War as one of a secular autocratic government fighting a religious militant group. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Regional identities, as I'll talk next about the Rash Valley and Harog, had a huge role in what was going on there. Okay, so Exhibit 1, unlikely to. I think it's unlikely that this was an example of Islamism, despite the way it's been portrayed by several folk. Rash Valley, 2010. Just a little bit of background. Again, most of you know this far better than I. In September 2010, militants in the Rash Valley killed 26 government soldiers. These indeed were militants. There's no doubt about the fact that these were armed men who killed government soldiers. These armed men had escaped from a jail, maximum security prison in Dushanbe, the preceding month. They had been charged with being members of the IMU and seeking to topple the Rahman government. And digging a little bit deeper, if you look at the government narrative, the leader of these militants, a man named Dovlatov, is a very well-known warlord. His brother had been detained the previous month and had said that his brother was running, was running a terrorist training camp and was being aided by foreign mercenaries. So Dovlatov's brother confessed and said that yes, we were up to no good. If you look at people who've done a lot of research on the ground, and I'm thinking of the work, for example, by John Heathershaw and Sophie Roche, who worked in the Rash Valley and talked to people about what happened here, the impression that a lot of people have come away with was this wasn't about Islamist militancy by any stretch of the imagination. Rather, this was about who controlled the region at the local level. There had been a unwritten but very much understood agreement between people like Dovlatov, other warlords, and the central government that there were spheres of influence within Tajikistan, and Rahman at the time was trying to rewrite this agreement and extend central control over the region. And a lot of people will argue that this, particularly at the local level, a lot of people argue this was the reason for the clash. It wasn't Islamism by any stretch of the imagination. It was a battle over who controlled territory, revenues at the local level. Harog is very much the same thing. If you look at the events of Harog in 2012, the narrative here, at least the one offered by the government, is not dissimilar to the one in Rash Valley. Here, 17 government soldiers, 30 militants died in Harog in July 2012. The best we can tell, the spark that led to the conflict was the killing of General Nazarov. I did some work in Harog, not last summer, fortunately. It would have probably been a little sticky if I was working in Harog last summer, but the previous summer. And the narrative that I heard from most people in Harog was General Nazarov was drunk. It was an incident that happened close to the Ishkashim border and had treated local warlords, for lack of a better term, poorly in an encounter. And that encounter led to a fight, which led to Nazarov being killed. That's the local narrative. I mean, we can dispute that. If you look at the Western narrative about this, a lot of people will say that this was a fight over the Ishkashim border and who controlled the drug trade, and that Dushanbe was trying to reassert control over the border and capture the revenues that are coming from the drug trade. In my work in Harog, I didn't get much on this. Granted, I suppose most people, if they had knowledge, probably wouldn't want to tell me that this is what was going on. So I concede that point. But what I did find interesting about this experience was when you spoke to people in Harog, there was immense pride in the protests of July 23rd. Protests where people perceive that the pressure that the population exerted encouraged, indeed forced, the government troops back into the barracks. So it wasn't fighting between Ayumbekov and the government troops. So rather it was the mass protests that followed the fighting that drove the government troops back into the barracks. And this was indicative of a much larger phenomena of who really was the just ruler in Harog, in Gorno-Badakhshan. And the idea here is that, again, the government had violated the unwritten contract of local rule, had tried to reassert power, and the citizens of Harog and Gorno-Badakhshan had pushed the government away. The government said that this was not the case, that really what was going on was that Ayumbekov had partnered with Afghan Islamists and was receiving tens of millions of dollars from abroad to destabilize the government. So that was the government narrative. So you can see the two different sides that are coming here, just as we saw the two different sides in the Tajik Civil War, the two different sides in Rosh Valley 2010, and here again in Harog in 2012. Okay, so what's to be done? Right? What's the U.S. government to do here? I mean, I suppose the U.S. government is somewhat tangential to this whole issue. And the main point I want to leave you with is, again, that we rush to label these things militant Islam, and I think if you look at it more carefully, these are far from militant Islam. But the U.S. government has a sense that it can intervene to a certain extent and intervene for the better. The U.S. government produces an interesting document called the Guide to Drivers of Violent Extremism, and this is something that the U.S. government, it does studies on violent extremism in all the places where it's operating to see whether or not it can continue operating, but this guide highlights 7 political drivers that we should be paying particular attention to, because if these drivers are present, the guide instructs that there is the potential. There is the potential for a movement towards radicalization and violent extremism. And let me just highlight these 7 for you. The first is a denial of political rights and civil liberties. Violation of human rights is the second. Widespread government corruption. The presence of ungoverned territories. A history of prior militant conflict. External state support for domestic violent extremist groups, and lastly, illegitimate yet unchallenged national governments. Right? Let's run through the empirics, right, of the Tajik case. Denial of political rights and civil liberties. If you look at, there's many of these indices out there. But I'll just choose Freedom House for a shorthand. Tajikistan consistently has rated as not free by all the measures of political rights and civil liberties that Freedom House scores countries on. Violations of human rights. I'll just run through a few. Islamic groups are banned from organizing in Tajikistan. HT, no matter what you think about HT was banned in 2000. Tablighi Jamaat was banned in 2006. Salafism was made illegal in 2009. And then the most interesting one of all, the law on parental responsibility passed in August 2011, which had as its goal preventing youth from going to mosque in Tajikistan. So violation of human rights, I mean, if you view religion as a fundamental human right, or the right to practice religion, I think here we have evidence of violation of human rights. Corruption. I was gonna share some personal examples, but I'd probably better not. I'll just give you the Transparency International rating of Tajikistan. Tajikistan ranks 152nd out of 175 countries as far as corruption. So being higher up on the TI scale if you're against corruption, being higher up is not a good thing. Shares company with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan as being very corrupt. A study by the World Bank, which is actually a little bit more rigorous than the TI study, where they interviewed businesses, found that 60% of all businesses reported that government corruption was a significant obstacle for conducting their business in Tajikistan. So corrupt country for short. Presence of ungoverned territories. Except for Dushanbe, this is what Tajikistan is, right? I mean, there's a lot of ungoverned territories in Tajikistan. I think the Rasht events and the Harog events, I'd say they're not ungoverned. They're just not governed by Rahman or governed particularly well, or they're contested, right? So, but certainly presence of ungoverned territories. History of prior conflict, I think the Civil War, here we have that. Illegitimate yet unchallenged national government. I think we saw that in spades with the March 1st parliamentary elections. There was no opposition party that got into parliament. I suppose you could say the opposition is just really weak. Then that begs the question, well, why is the opposition really weak? Maybe because they're chasing the opposition out of the country, but then killing members of the opposition. So the one thing that's not, to my knowledge, present, although the Tajik government would claim otherwise, is external support for violent extremist groups. I haven't seen any evidence of that, although I know, particularly in the Harol case, the government claimed that that indeed was present. I personally have not come across evidence of that. Okay, so what should the United States government do? I mean, these are just a few very basic suggestions. And these are things that if you're in the US government, you'd say, well, we're already doing, and to a certain extent, yes, but I would argue that there's a lot of room for doing more of this. Support for political parties. One of the fundamental challenges that the opposition faces in Tajikistan is actually organizing and getting clear platforms, the mechanics of creating political parties. The U.S. government has certainly considerable experience trying to promote this. Not much of this has been done in Tajikistan, partly because it's been hard to get in. But this is something that can, I think, productively be expanded. Encouraging government decentralization. And here, the encouraging is actually encouraging the central government to accept government decentralization that already exists. Right? It's already there. So perhaps institutionalizing this and making it more legitimate rather than contested. And then lastly, I would say walking back the recent attack on religious freedoms that we've seen on the part of the Dushanbe government. If you read a lot of the local press, independent press, many people are beginning to say that Tajikistan, the government's policy towards Islam, is becoming uncomfortably close to what we've seen over the past 15, 20 years of the Uzbek government's policy towards Islam, moving in that direction. And I think, in the case of Uzbekistan, the government actually has guns to reinforce repression. In the case of Tajikistan, the government doesn't have the repressive capacity to pursue that kind of policy. So repression of religious groups without the capacity to repress militant groups is a dangerous combination, I think, particularly in Tajikistan, particularly given the history of civil war. So again, if you look over the past 25 years, very little evidence to suggest that there is militancy. If you look objectively at drivers of militancy, many of them are present in Tajikistan, so there's potential for militancy, and addressing those drivers, I think, would preclude future developments of radical Islam in Tajikistan. Thank you.